我住那罗大学。
Jashikale and welcome. Thank you all for joining today's live panel discussion on the 11th PANCHEN LAMA. We have today a very distinguished group of panelists. We have Zeekgyab Rinpoche, President of the Central Tibetan Administration, Zeekgyab Rinpoche, Abbot of Deshilombo Monastery, the traditional seat of the PANCHEN Lamas, Sophie Richardson, China Director at Human Rights Watch, Arif Virani, Member of the Canadian Parliament and Chair of the Parliamentary Friends of Tibet, Inzi Dojla, a Commissioner at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and Matteo Makachi, President of the International Campaign for Tibet. Thank you to all our panelists joining us on this important occasion. My name is Pema Tolatsang, and I'm an Asia Officer at the National Endowment for Democracy, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. So to begin, I'd just like to provide some brief context for today's talk. Today, April 25th, is the 31st birthday of the PANCHEN LAMA. In 1995, His Holiness the Dalai Lama recognized GEDUN CHOEKYI as the 11th PANCHEN Lama, making this 6-year-old boy the second most important spiritual figure in Tibetan Buddhism. Shortly after His Holiness's announcement, the Chinese government abducted this young child, making him at the time the world's youngest political prisoner. Despite international outcry, the Chinese regime, even to this day, has refused to release any information about the child's whereabouts or evidence that he is even alive. So with that, I'd like to ask Zeekgyab Rinpoche to share his remarks. After that, I'll ask each of our panelists to share their insights, close the session with the Q&A. Zeekgyab, if you could please begin.
Thank you, Pamela, and especially to all the people who are watching this panel discussion. I want to, applaud the initiative of the Deshilombo Monastery for organizing this panel on a very important day, because today is actually a day of celebration, because today is the 31st birthday of 11th PANCHEN Lama, GEDUN CHOEKYI. Unfortunately, today is also a day of sadness, because he has disappeared for the last 25 years. Normally, when it's your birthday, your parents and siblings and neighbors and friends will come and be with you together. But the Chinese government has denied this basic right to GEDUN CHOEKYI for 25 years in a row. From some accounts, his parents are not allowed to meet him regularly. In fact, not even a few times a year. His grandparents were forced to live in China, and then they, could meet him only a few times, and till when they were very old and when they were dying, they were not allowed to return and settle in Tibet. And his siblings are definitely denied this, right to be with their brother and celebrate his birthday. But on behalf of Tibetan people and CTA, I want to wish PANCHEN Lama a very happy birthday. Wherever you are, we wish you well, and we all want to see you, hear you, to be blessed by you, like the great 10th PANCHEN Lama. The GEDUN CHOEKYI was actually recognized by the committee established by the Chinese government of Deshilombo Monastery. He was endorsed by His Holiness the Dalai Lama as the PANCHEN Lama, but unfortunately, right after the endorsement, he has disappeared, and CTA and Tibet support groups and Tibetan associations around the world have made annual appeals to the United Nations, especially to the relevant commission in Geneva, but they are not able to get information about his whereabouts. So PANCHEN Rinpoche remains a tragic figure. His situation reflects the tragic reality in Tibet, because even as a child of 5 or 6 years old, was not allowed to be with the family, to practice own religion and become a spiritual leader, which all the Tibetan people expected and hoped that he would become. But wherever he is, we wish him all the best, and we want to say be strong. But I also want to highlight the fact that because of this coronavirus which originated in Wuhan, the global pandemic has forced even a panel discussion on Panchen Lama to do it virtually. Normally, the Tibetans and friends all over the world will be approaching officials of various governments and highlight and advocate the issue of GEDUN CHOEKYI NYIMA. But this year, they are denied even that right. So it's a real irony that the global pandemic, which originated in China, has forced even to have a panel discussion on Panchen Lama to be held virtually. And I hope the international community will make the Chinese government accountable for the coronavirus and the global pandemic that's going on around the world. But I also want to thank our friends around the world for being with us on this important day. And there are many who are watching and supporting for the cause of Tibet. And today I can clearly see a great panel with Professor Tins Dojila, Arif Biryani, and Zeekgyab Rinpoche, and Matteo, and Sophie Richardson. Thank you very much to be in the panel, and it's a privilege to be with you all and for all your support for these many years. I also want to say a few things about the 10th Panchen Lama because he was a true patriot as far as Tibetan cause is concerned. From the very beginning, he was very, patriotic. He did all he could in a very difficult circumstances in Tibet. For example, at the age of 24, after the occupation of Tibet, he submitted a petition, which is now popularly known as 70,000 characters petition to the Chinese leadership. And Mao Zedong called it a poison arrow because the petition was very critical of the Chinese government's actions and policies in Tibet. For example, he listed that more than 97 or 8% of monasteries and nunneries were destroyed in Tibet. 99% of monks and nuns were disrobed, and Tibetan culture and Tibetan identity, Tibetan language were discouraged. The cultural assimilation, forced sterilization of Tibetan women, all these were highlighted in that report. Now, this report is very important for another reason, because whenever you have a discourse on Tibet with Chinese officials and Chinese scholars, they say, look, the destruction that took place in Tibet even happened in China during the Cultural Revolution. But Panchen Lama's report clearly affirms that it's not true, because the report was submitted in 1962. That's 3 years before the Cultural Revolution, which means all this destruction of monasteries and nunneries and cultural institutions and discouragement of Tibetan language were a deliberate attempt or a strategy on the part of the Chinese government to destroy Tibetan civilization, Tibetan culture, Tibetan identity. Because of this report, he was incarcerated till 1977. He suffered enormously in prison, often in solitary confinement. If you read Baba Phuntsho Wange's autobiography, where he in fact forgot to speak after a decade of solitary confinement. But Panchen Rinpoche, in his the biography, you will find that every week or so, when he was taken out for to see the daylight, he used to fight with prison guards so that he could mumble something, so that he could not forget to speak and he could maintain his sanity. So for us Tibetans, Panchen Rinpoche is such a revered figure, such a high-ranking Lama. to go through that kind of suffering, what we call tamzing, it's really sad. But the Chinese government did not spare even him. After his release in 1977, right after, he organized a prayer for long life of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and specifically in 1987, he gave a very critical speech at the TAR Standing Committee meeting in Lhasa, and especially in 1989, on January 24th, he gave a very critical speech in which he said the Chinese government claim of benefit given to the Tibetan people pales in comparison to destruction of the Communist Party of China in Tibet. So there were more destruction, and Tibetans lost more after the occupation of Tibet than the benefits that the Chinese government claimed to have provided to the Tibetan people. So in short, Panchen Lama was a true patriot. He was very courageous, very morally upright person. He traveled all over Tibet in various places, even in small villages, encouraging Tibetan language, Tibetan culture, revival of Tibetan Buddhism, and most importantly, to be proud of being a Tibetan. He also opened many schools all over Tibet and encouraged many Tibetan children to go to China to study, to get educated. So his great legacy is what we see in Tibet now. The revival of Tibetan Buddhism, Tibetan culture, Tibetan language, Tibetan scriptures, publication of all these Buddhist scriptures were mainly attributed to his great contribution. And hence we owe a great deal to the Panchen Lama and the suffering that he underwent. We all should remember. I hope and wish that the younger generation of Tibetan people will remember the great contribution made by Panchen Lama, and the millennials will, come and rally to support the case of GEDUN CHOEKYI NYIMA. CTA has launched a month-long campaign, and it starts today, and then it will go on till May 17th, because that's the day when GEDUN CHOEKYI NYIMA disappeared and Chinese government has abducted. And I'm very grateful. Since his disappearance on May 17th, 1995, the U.S. State Department responded and issued statements in asking for his whereabouts to the Chinese government, and the many governments like the United Kingdom, Canada, Poland, France, European Parliament, and UN-related agencies all have passed resolution, issued statements, and issued reports about GEDUN CHOEKYI NYIMA. This, we must continue to do so. And on 8 April of this year, the Samuel Kogolati, the federal parliamentarian of Belgium, issued a public statement about Panchen Lama. And just recently, 24 European Parliament members issued a joint statement in support of Panchen Lama and asking Chinese government for his release and demanding his whereabouts. So I, on behalf of CTA, remain very grateful to all the members of Parliament, to all the government officials, and especially to the panelists who are here, to continue to speak for 11 Panchen Lama. And I want to urge that we continue this campaign, and we demand his immediate release. And I hope the Chinese government will, pay heed to our call and do the right thing. That is to release GEDUN CHOEKYI NYIMA and let him to be with Tibetan people. and let him bless Tibetan people, let him play his spiritual role in the Tibetan Buddhist world. With that, I want to thank Zeekgyab Rinpoche, the head abbot of Tashi Lumpo Monastery, for providing the leadership. He was scheduled to go to U.S. Congress and to the Canadian Parliament. Even his visa was granted to the U.S., but unfortunately he's not able to do it. But I'm pretty sure the Zeekgyab Rinpoche will lead this campaign with the support of Tashi Lumpo Monastery, with our friends all over the world, and we'll make sure that the Gendu Choekyi NYIMA is not forgotten. And we hope that one day soon he'll be released and he'll be with us. So once again, I want to thank the panelists for giving me this opportunity, and wishing you all the best. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Zeekgyab Ma, for your wonderful remarks. Next, we will hear from Zeekgyab Rinpoche, abbot of Tashi Lumpo Monastery. Rinpoche will be giving his talk in Tibetan, and I will be providing an English translation afterward. Rinpoche, sorona.
Naso. Ani tharin, diga kunsi penchen Rinpoche Gendu Choekyi NYIMA cho, gongrang somju soji le pepe kuyi chunga da tumne, ani chage thoni penchen Rinpoche ne da tolya, ani songxie da zholeng nawar pemkin rangshung yu pimi jingzu gi sekyong, ani bunra ma losan sengge cho dang, giji zhuo mi topdang tashi sobe gyana di sengge genzi jamgu sobi to, gana xin ari chode rangwa topdang lenzo gi unzi sobo bunra ma kusha tinzu dojila, Canada zhozo tobi tumi kushab arif, giji pedwe legu kangi giji kushab metu, che neyo muten neyo uchi namba ngabyo gi, zede cheme la madwe ba tiringi zholeng na nyamshu na watela ya, ani chemingi, ani chamji da tuji che shugyi, Teishin chado di nang la ya, nyamshu na nge gi, ani zamli mimang yong la ya, chamji shugyu da jel, ngazo changme gi, gaju sungze gi toa ne, ani kunsi penche Rinpoche cho ki chunga sungsi shuya tenri chak yori. Ani ta tsawe taring tense ngwe ni ani jigi kunsi penche Rinpoche kundi chukchi ba chenpo cho kui chunga tushin ki yongkyab seda shu simba cha yori. Tenri indi di nangdoyen da chayni shubha ina. Ani chilo chidong gubja guju konga. Chinda nga begi che jubding ni. Ani kunsi penche kundi chukchi ba chenpo cho. Zhe yabyung kokor kushab chate Rinpoche da chiaba, ani gyaman sishungi zenji da kasong chame da kiwa cheche, ani longa yishu zangas zhogu yori. Dende yindu dedagi ring la ya, ani nambazu zebe, shungze da shungze ma yinbe, ani soba changme ngöne pyodun chi da khabar, ani kunsi penche Rinpoche ki nedun ki tola ya, ani chi ngushu gyusumne pezul hoba meba tang, yaga nangshin legu namang rabda rinpa pe shimba dedala ya, ani shije ngi ki tesa tashi lupi tsab shu che, ani jesu irang dang, lekso nga ju shu ya chi yin. Ta dende yindu dedagi ringla ya, gyaman seshungi ngwe ni, ani kunsi penchen Rinpoche ki nedang di, ani kayu, ani tana, ani bangda kongze, kubar da jeba, dende kubar da jeba, dende dēnāng yō mā rī, dēndē jēgyū mē bā chā tī yō rī, dēndē yīndū dēdā kī tō lī yā, ngā zū cāng mē kī, anī kūsī pēnchē Rinpoche kū tsū shū yō mē kī tō lī yā, hā chāng lō tsab chēmbū yu kī rāng xīn chēn chī chā tī yō rī.
On the auspicious occasion of the 31st birth anniversary of the 11th PANCHEN LAMA Gendu Choekyi NYIMA, it is my honor and pleasure to welcome the panelists who have graciously agreed to participate in this panel discussion. I would also like to welcome people from around the world who are watching and celebrating this bittersweet occasion of the PANCHEN Lama's 31st birthday. Tashi Lumpo Monastery has released its official statement on the 11th PANCHEN Lama, and the statement highlights that over 25 years have passed since the disappearance and imprisonment of the PANCHEN Lama at the hands of the Chinese government. From the moment of his disappearance, we have consistently and vigorously demanded the immediate release of the PANCHEN Lama, his parents, and Zeekgyab Rinpoche. However, the Chinese government has turned a deaf ear to demands from around the world, and moreover, have deliberately obfuscated the entire issue. we have no idea whether those abducted are alive or not. Rinpoche Songrona.
Kunsi Panchen Rinpoche ki nedun di pyo da Himalaya zobe pyo nangden zangma sebe zamni chili ya kene chenpo shira chagi yore. Ane kain shuba ina Kunsi Panchen Rinpoche nedun di gyamar sishun ki nguyene ane karso gore chepsi ki nedun kone ki lacha tabu chik sungche tende nangi yore. Ina yang tuyang wame tola ya Kunsi Panchen Rinpoche ki nedun tingi ane chik chepsi da majeba ane checho ki toane habar do pyo miri 이 최다 리숑 기입의 제바 보다 대다가 토네 아니 개천부지 차기 요래 아니 군시 벤처를 붙이 다 내된디 최초기 토네 슈베이나 아니 지 자와 엽세니기 자람당 대한나시 벤처 군진 주베기 회기 최다 리숑 땡시 미리의 제베 튼도 제제 가진 가지 경유메 대다당 아니 대한나시 회기 최다 리숑 기입의 제바 잠니지 진노다부 오다 대라 소베기 아니 가르소그래 당 대한나시 에너지 단답도 개갑 하장 망배기 아니 지 초소 카다 냠제 계속이 집에 톱당당 대한나시 조합이 톱당 소리야 현소리야 아니 군시 벤처를 무치 lö저 고야기 아니 지 삼차레 된데 토리야 레규 나마 빼요리 딘데 인디 잠니 개갑 패무치 낭도 아니 자나 숑리야 벤처를 무치 lö저 고야기 레규 아니 빼다 빼신 버티기 아니 다자 벤처를 무지게 내된디 아니 지기 배기 라친 잠기 내된 잠 마임바 아니 잠리 미망기 아니 도구 첨부 제세기 계지 아니 등시에 토기 내된 개첨부시 아니 자기 와레스 아니 대단다 타마들이야 부규 슈예지리야 아니 지기 귀시 벤처를 무치 다 내된 디토리아 아니 냠제 개조 저베 슝데의 슝데 마이바 넘버2 창월로리아 단다버도 아니 군시 벤처를 붙이기 내든 토리아 베절 허바메바 나와 신도 다동장 알레라 아니 지기 가르소 그래 군시 벤처를 붙이 등이 교원의 뉴도 아니 lö저 토비아 당 아니 군시 벤처를 붙이 아니 군지 죽지바 등이 아니 진노 공사 경부 전부 초기 공시 시송기 토네 아니 지 퇴삼 로미엘로 소버 쉐니 잠니 지리야 아니 텐드 제바 랍친 경 토야 당 안다가나시 랑기 텐서 트시 리비기 시팅 아소 슈 토야 당 아니 지 가서 배 미리 지기 디두리아 고 공매기 제버치다 장원 능신치 텐데지 경 토야리아 아니 지 고 탑게 주동기 권에 배절 허범에바 나로 나스체체 아니 시진이기 텐서 트시 리비 삽슈체 리비니 슈기여 토지체
China, a government known for its egregious human rights violations, was recently appointed to the UN Human Rights Council panel. This is a matter of great concern to the world, and in particular to those peoples repressed by the CCP. It also has dire repercussions on our efforts to free the Panchen Lama. However, given the diminishing credibility of the CCP in the eyes of the world and its own people, we believe that there will be a transformation within China. Consequently, we believe that the Tibetan issue will gain momentum and resolution. The tragic disappearance of the Panchen Lama is a clear indication of the CCP's deliberate attempt to destroy Tibetan culture and religion, and a blatant violation of international human rights law. Many international parliamentarians, UN commissions, and rights groups have demanded the release of the Panchen Lama. Despite China's refusal to address the matter, the issue remains very much alive. The struggle must continue with renewed energy and vigor. We earnestly request rights advocates around the world to support the Tibetan cause and the immediate release of the Panchen Lama, his family, and Chade Rinpoche. Thank you. Next, we'll move to Sophie Richardson of Human Rights Watch.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join you this morning, and especially thank you to Zeekgyab Rinpoche. We will certainly follow through on your suggestions. There is no doubt about that. And good morning also to the Sikyong and to so many other friends in the effort to protect Tibetans' human rights. It's an honor to be with you this morning. We only wish that we literally could be with you. We certainly look forward to helping welcome visitors to Washington. Just a few quick words about how Human Rights Watch sees the Panchen Lama's case. It is certainly one of the Chinese Party state's longest running and most egregious human rights violations, a quarter century long enforced disappearance. I think it's also perhaps a harbinger of the extent to which Chinese authorities have not been content to try to control religion, but to literally remake it in an image or in a shape that suits their political agenda. I think it's also an example of collective punishment, not just for the Panchen Lama and his family, but also for Gyaltsen Norbu and his family. Their lives were radically changed and their rights seriously violated, essentially in order to control the appointment of the next Dalai Lama. The manipulation of the selection process in the two boys is not just an abuse of the title and the position, but also the people. I think it's worth pointing out that Gyaltsen Norbu has not generally been accepted by the public, some of whom we know to have been bribed or threatened to attend his events. The perhaps two best examples of this, the Kala Chakra ceremony staged in Shigatse in 2016, but conversely, the tumultuous public welcome of Rinzin Wangmo to Tasho Lumpo in January 2019 on the 30th anniversary of her father's death. I think both of these occasions have shown that Tibetans remain deeply devoted to the Panchen Lama, who was chosen through a proper process and has the kind of legitimacy with the community. And that, I think, will be a key in the discussion about the future of religion for the community. Human Rights Watch has spent 25 years documenting serious human rights violations of Tibetan people, including the forced relocation of nomads, severe restrictions on civic groups and community life, and increasing restrictions on religious activity, even the ability of elderly people to perform kora, one of the simplest, most I think, intimate gestures of religious observation, of political prisoners, and most recently the slow erosion of mother tongue education for Tibetans from Tibetan communities around the world to our work on this issue also shows how strongly people feel about language as an expression of their identity, their faith. We will, of course, continue this work and our advocacy. I think some of the tools that are available to people now include things like targeted sanctions, like the Global Magnitsky Act in the United States, and comparable legislation that's being developed in other countries, the UK, for example. I think the community has done an extraordinary job of using United Nations mechanisms to press for reviews of everything from the Panchen Lama's case to access to other different kinds of cultural rights, including language rights, and there are more opportunities on the near-term horizon for those issues to get more attention. But I think it's also critical that governments continue to explicitly call on the Chinese authorities to free all of those Tibetans who have been unjustly detained, including and specifically the Panchen Lama. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you for all of your advocacy and the advocacy by Human Rights Watch. Next, we have Arif Varani, a longtime champion of Tibet in the Canadian Parliament. Arif, you could please share your remarks.
Sure. Thank you very much, Pamela, for moderating. Thank you to everyone who is on the panel today. Tashilek, Niminla Arif Viranian. My name is Arif Virani. As Pema mentioned, I'm the Canadian Member of Parliament. My riding is the community of Parkdale High Park in Toronto, which is home to about 7,000 Tibetan Canadians, the largest diaspora outside of Nepal and India in one concentrated area in the West. I'm very proud to represent that group, but I'm also serving as the chair of the Parliamentary Friends of Tibet within the Canadian Parliament, and I've been doing so since 2015. And I have become a staunch advocate for the cause of Tibet, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and the Middle Way approach. I wanted to build on some of what has been covered by Zeekgyab La and also by Sophie Richardson and by Rinpoche La. And I want to say welcome to Matteo and to Tenzin Dorje La. It is honestly an honor to be among such a distinguished panel of individuals. And I also want to just stop and just momentarily say thank you to the Tibetan community literally across the globe that is stepping up and helping people in need during this international COVID-19 crisis. So to all of you, I would say Tujiche. As Zeekgyab La outlined, today is obviously an auspicious day. It's the 31st birthday of GEDUN Chokyi NYIMA. And obviously for him, we would say happy birthday. And I would say Sangma Panchen Rinpoche Trunka La Tashidile. But obviously, as Zeekgyab La outlined, it's an occasion with very mixed emotions. As you've heard from many of the speakers thus far, he at the time was the world's youngest political prisoner, and having disappeared on May 17th, 1995, 3 days after His Holiness recognized him as the 11th Panchen Lama. And as Zeekgyab mentioned, this May 17th will mark 25 years in detention, which is 25 years too long. And I appreciate the gravity with which Sophie described it. It is a grave situation of sort of Nelson Mandela-like proportions at this stage, which is really an egregious stain on the international human rights record. In terms of me, for those of you that don't know me, before becoming a parliamentarian, I was a constitutional and human rights lawyer. And I believe in my core in confronting injustice. And I've attempted to do that both as a lawyer and also now as a parliamentarian, informed by a lot of what I've learned, to be frank, from my Tibetan Canadian constituents about the Tibetan struggle and some of the basic violations of human rights that are occurring. I've taken the opportunities I have and the pulpit I have as a parliamentarian to speak about basic religious freedoms and linguistic rights for the Tibetan people, to speak about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and to speak about the middle way approach in the House of Commons in Canada. With regard to the Panchen Lama, I've raised his case in the Canadian Parliament as well, specifically in the context of when we had a Chinese delegation which was representing the Tibetan Autonomous Region appearing before one of our standing committees, the Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. That occurred in May of 2018, when I had the opportunity to ask Pema Wangdi, the Deputy of the People's Congress of the Tibet Autonomous Region, about the Panchen Lama's whereabouts. And the response that I received was a simple response that we've heard, I think, repeatedly since 2015, that GEDUN Chokyi NYIMA is living a simple and normal life, and he and his family do not wish to be disturbed. What is coupled with the advocacy that I and other parliamentarians are doing is what we are doing as a national government. And the national government record in Canada dates back all the way to 1995, the year of the Panchen Lama's disappearance, when Canada first raised his case with the Chinese authorities. 3 years later, the Canadian Embassy in Beijing delivered to the Chinese 1,000 birthday cards for the Panchen Lama from Canadian children. Over the years, on repeated occasions, Canada has sought from the Chinese information on the location of the Panchen Lama, his parents, his level of education, and the expected date of his return, along with his parents. Those requests have included calls to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Religion and Belief in order to be able to visit the Panchen Lama. In 2014, Canada spoke at the United Nations Human Rights Council, stating that the government of China's ongoing persecution of religious and ethnic minorities, specifically in Xinjiang and Tibet, was incompatible with its international obligations as well as its constitution. And I would highlight the point of Xinjiang right now insofar as I think there's commonality that needs to be reinforced in terms of the religious persecution that Tibetan Buddhists are facing with what is going on with Uyghur Muslims. And I say that as a Muslim Canadian. I say that as a person who's a Muslim Canadian representing a lot of Tibetans. And I say that during the month of Ramadan, which we are now in, and about the religious persecution that has gone on too long. Canada, just returning to the narrative, Canada urged authorities to immediately release all individuals detained for exercising their human rights, including their right to freedom of religion and expression. This is again in the 2014 intervention. We've also, as a government, and that's a government that's crossed political stripes, consistently advocated for substantive and meaningful dialogue between the Chinese government and the Dalai Lama and his representatives to work toward a resolution of long-standing issues that would be acceptable to both sides. Apropos of some of the work that Sophie and the folks at Human Rights Watch are doing, we have a list of high-profile human rights cases that are global, but that list includes 2 Tibetans right now, Mr. Tashi Wangchuk and Mr. Druklo. We raised those cases directly with the Chinese on November 28th of 2017 with the Deputy Vice Chairman of the Standing Committee of the People's Congress of the TAR, reiterating that Mr. Wangchuk and Mr. Druklo's rights to express their opinion should be protected and they should not be detained for doing so. At the same meeting in November 2017, Canada also raised once again the case of the 11th Panchen Lama, calling for his unconditional release of himself and his family and for a Canadian delegation to be able to visit them. In July of 2018, with our American colleagues at a ministerial meeting to advance religious freedom in Washington, D.C., parties expressed their concerns about the significant restrictions on religious freedom in China and called on the Chinese government to respect the human rights of all individuals. The text of that declaration stated that many members of religious minority groups in China face severe repression and discrimination because of their beliefs, including Tibetan Buddhists. And then in November of 2018, Canada made public recommendations to China on human rights as part of the Universal Periodic Review Mechanism at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. At that time, we recommended that China end the persecution and prosecution on the basis of religion or belief, including for Tibetan Buddhists. So I outline all of that because I think it's important to to lay out the track record of international advocacy by the Canadian government. But I also think what I want to make clear as part of this panel discussion is my personal commitment as a Member of Parliament in Canada for the community of Parkdale High Park, as chair of the Canada Parliamentary Friends of Tibet group. My commitment is to continue to personally raise the issue of Tibet wherever and whenever possible. And that's not just with regard to the whereabouts of the Panchen Lama, but with regard to promoting also the basic religious and linguistic freedoms of Tibetans, as well as the middle way approach. So I'll conclude on that note and say once again, thank you for having me and including me in today's important panel discussion. Tujiche Gadinche. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Arif. And, thank you for all of your work in Canada and thank you for your leadership of the PFT. Greatly appreciate that. Next, Commissioner Tenzin Dorjila, do you want to start?
Thank you, Pamela, and hello to all my distinguished co-panelists. Tashitele and greetings to all on this auspicious day. Happy 31st birthday of Panchen NYIMA. Paradoxically, this birthday has turned out to be one of the saddest days. Not only that, we couldn't celebrate happily Panchen NYIMA's birthday, but he himself couldn't celebrate his own birthday. I have the privilege and honor to work on the United States Commission for International Religious Freedom to advance international religious freedom around the world. And in particular, I adopted Panchen NYIMA as my prisoners of conscience among thousands of prisoners of conscience in Tibet. And I have been joined by Vice Chair Nadine Minza, my colleague, and also Congressman James McGovern to adopt Panchen NYIMA as their prisoners of conscience as well. So for 4 years, I have been vigorously, advocating for Panchen Lama's whereabouts, and Communist China has forcefully disappeared him and his family, him since 6-year-old, and it has been 25 years, and we have not received even basic information about his well-being. That definitely violates the international, freedom and human rights standards. And when we talk about Panchen NYIMA, it's not a story about just one individual. He represents Tibet, Tibetan Buddhism. Panchen Lama is an institution just like His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And so it's very unfortunate that we have not even seen any videographic evidence that I have consistently called for, especially during this pandemic time when we have so much anxiety. And definitely we would like to know if Panchen NYIMA and his family are safe and well. So China must show videographic evidence to the world that he is still alive and he is fine. So Panchen Rinpoche's case really reflects the very sad story about the overall condition of religious freedom in Tibet. And as we know, that China has systematically, continuously, and egregiously violated religious freedom across China and in Tibet. And they had large-scale destructions of Larungar and Yachengar, displacing thousands of monks and nuns. So that's not religious freedom existing in Tibet, as we can say. So I think February 1st, they implemented many new regulations, and particularly there is Article 22, which I want to read to you, which reads, religious organizations should provide interpretations for doctrines and canons that meet the requirements of the development and progress of modern China and in accordance with the glorious traditional Chinese culture, unquote. So this is a clear case of Sinicization or sinification of religions in Tibet, so this is a very serious matter, as we know that in more recent case, China has been doing everything possible to interfere in the recognizing the next possible reincarnations of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and that is certainly violates religious freedom rights. And I'm very grateful to Ambassador at Large of the United States of America and ex officio of Yusuf Sam Brownback, who traveled especially to Dharamsala last year to meet with His Holiness Dalai Lama, and so on this particular issue, and wanted to internationalize how important the reincarnations of His Holiness and Panchen Lama are to Tibetan people and Tibet. The great news is that the world has not forgotten about the people of Tibet and the Panchen NYIMA. That's why we are all here to continue the awareness campaign. So I would urge the administration to implement the Global Magnitsky Accountability Act, under which Chinese officials who are responsible for the forceful disappearance of Panchen Lama and his family, they must be sanctions must be laid upon them. It's wonderful that the Congress started to discuss before the pandemic about Tibet Policy and Support Act. USAP unanimously support that, and we strongly urge all the members of the Congress to pass it. And we know that Congress is dealing with the pandemic right now, but as they meet later on, we seriously and urgently ask the Congress to pass it and for the president to sign it. So under this Tibet Policy and Support Act, again, the Chinese officials who are responsible for the persecutions of religious minorities all over in Tibet, and particularly the Panchen Lama's case, they will be brought to justice. So with that, once again, on behalf of all Tibetans, I make a traditional mandala offering to Panchen Lama CHOEKYI for his long life and for healthy life. And so may he be released immediately and soon, and we have the pleasure and honor to receive his blessing in person. So respectfully, I advocate for his immediate release, Commissioner Tenzin Dorje.
Thank you, Tenzin Dorje. Tibetans around the world are very proud of your appointment on USURF and very grateful for all the work you do through the commission. Thank you. Next, we'll move to Mateo Nakachi at ICT.
Thank you, Pema, and thank you, Rinpoche, for inviting me to join this discussion, and also thank you to the colleagues who have been, speaking so far. So a lot have been said already. So I would like to focus on a more, general, a systemic issue that the case of the Panchen Lama really represents, and I think it represents the reality that Chinese rule in Tibet, which has now been going on for over 60 years, has one goal, which is to undermine the very foundations of Tibetan culture and identity, especially targeting one of the most beloved institutions of Tibetan Buddhism. And the Panchen Lama is certainly one of them. So by kidnapping the 11th Panchen Lama and replacing him with unfortunately, someone who's now used as an impostor, the Chinese government made this objective very clear. They want to control and dominate Tibetan Buddhism as a tool, possibly to control Tibetan society at large. But they do that, and they're willing to do that, by disregarding and in the end destroying the traditions and teachings that are now benefiting millions of people, the lives of millions of people around the world who practice Tibetan Buddhism. And this is because the Chinese government believes, has the illusion that through its power, through its economic might, they can control and suppress human conscience and human spirit. And through brute force, repression, corruption, intimidation, the Chinese government can indeed have some, temporary victories. It can instill fear, but it cannot certainly control the hearts and minds of the Tibetan people. And the situation is such, unfortunately, that, most likely China will continue to impose its political agenda, not only on the Tibetan people, but sadly also on other countries. And what we are living today, with the handling of the coronavirus epidemic by the Chinese governments, from the censorship and lack of information on what really happened in Wuhan, to the ongoing efforts to rewrite history, spread disinformation, or to blame others for the pandemic. This shows that the Chinese government is engaged in a geopolitical campaign to impose what they call, their Chinese model. Actually, it's a Chinese model of oppression as a model for the world. And this is something that we need to continue to be aware of, as these efforts represent both a great danger for the possible increase of, Chinese influence that may result worldwide, but also as an opportunity, because these efforts will also produce some resistance to these attempts. So another essential part of, China's geopolitical campaign and of their so-called Chinese model is to control the institution of the Dalai Lama, and basically to totally control Tibetan, spiritual traditions. And especially the focus on the Dalai Lama is to both to influence in the future Tibetan Buddhists well beyond Tibet, and this is due naturally thanks to the overwhelming popularity that the current 14th Dalai Lama has achieved in the world, and so they see a lot of soft power in controlling the future Dalai Lama. But this goal is also to undermine the sense of unity and cultural identity that the institution of the Dalai Lama has always provided to the Tibetan people. It has been the unifying force for Tibetans worldwide, and actually since the occupation of Tibet, and also to Tibetans inside Tibet. The Dalai Lama institution is a key element. So that's why the Chinese government are now focused on that. And historically, as you all know, the Panchen Lamas and the Dalai Lamas have been playing an important role in the process of recognizing, the respective reincarnations. So with the replacement of a genuine Panchen Lama that was identified by His Holiness Dalai Lama, the Chinese government now has set the stage to make sure that they can control the succession of future Dalai Lama. And in addition to that, the Chinese government has also passed official regulations that give to the Chinese state the formal authority to approve the selection of high Tibetan Lamas, which is clearly, without need to explain much further, a clear violation of the principle of religious freedom. So in order to push back against this China's offensive on religious freedom, ICT has worked in the US Congress to update the Tibetan Policy Act of 2002, which actually mentions specifically the case of the Panchen Lama and requires the State Department, the Secretary of State, to advocate on his behalf with the Chinese authorities. And unfortunately, we haven't seen this happening at the highest level over the last few years. But this revision of the Tibetan Policy Act of 2002, which is now called, and it has been mentioned before, the Tibetan Policy and Support Act of 2019. The issue is here that Tibetan Lamas, high Lamas, should be selected only by Tibetan Buddhists, not by any other governments. This is a very simple principle, but now clearly, because of China's regulations, Chinese government statements, there is a need to make it clear in the legislation. And our hope is that by building this support in the United States Congress, and actually the House of Representatives passed this legislation last January, we will be able also to work in other countries, in Canada, at the European Union level, in other governments, which are now have started to respond officially to members of parliament who have questioned what is their position regarding the future of, the selection of the future Dalai Lama. Are they going to be supportive of religious freedom and the rights of Tibetan Buddhists, or are they going to see clear violation of religious freedom by the Chinese government? So this legislation, as was mentioned by the Commissioner Tenzin Dorjela, makes it very clear that the Chinese officials who will be responsible for interfering in the selection of a future Dalai Lama will be subject to individual sanctions. And this, I think, it's a very important step to make the Chinese government understand that, despite their strategy, despite their goal, the international community will not accept another impostor like the one that replaced the Panchen Lama. And so there is a need now to really try to make this campaign an international one, so that also international institutions, for example, like the United Nations, finally speak up about the plans of the Chinese government to control Tibetan Buddhism. And so we hope that these efforts will continue also to raise the attention on the fate of the current Panchen Lama, and I think we have all the reasons through which we can continue to work together to advocate on his behalf. So I thank you for this opportunity.
Great, thank you very much, Matteo. Thank you and ICT for all of your advocacy on the TPSA in the U.S. Congress and abroad. So we don't have too much time left in the session. But I would like to move to the question and answer period because we've received a number of questions from viewers around the world. So just to facilitate this, I'll read the question and direct it to a specific panelist based on the topic. So the first question is from Switzerland, and it asks, China is using reincarnation as a political tool to subjugate Tibetans. It started with the Panchen Lama, and now China is trying to meddle with the institution of the Dalai Lama. What is the best way to counter this? And this on what Matteo was talking about in terms of China's weaponization of Tibetan Buddhism. Sophie, would you be able to answer this one for us?
Sure. On several levels, it's hard to improve on the explanation and the answer that Matteo just provided about the critical importance, not just of documenting how Beijing's process will lack legitimacy, given that it will not be one driven by an independent Tibetan Buddhist community, but for governments to start making clear now, not just wait until we're in the breach of this issue, so to speak, what they will do, how they will respond, how they will recognize who is the legitimate Dalai Lama. I think that really will be the key, doing both of those things to show what's wrong with China's process and to recognize the person who is chosen freely by the community that has the credibility and the faith to essentially run that process. But I think the sooner governments do that to make clear that Beijing's process will lack legitimacy, I think the better off Tibetans will be in a difficult period of transition.
Right, thank you very much, Sophie. Our next question is from the US, and it's for Arif Arani. It states, first of all, I would like to thank you and the Canadian Parliament for your support for the release of the 11th Panchen Lama. Tibetans inside and outside of Tibet are very concerned about the Panchen Lama's disappearance, even to this day. What sort of strategies can you and the Canadian Parliament put in place for the release of the Panchen Lama?
So thank you, Pema. Thank you for the question. And again, thank you to all the panelists for these really important insights. The question, I guess, it starts with some basic things. It's encouraging people to make sure that the issue of Tibet and Tibetan human rights violations that are occurring are always front and center and are not forgotten or not prioritized. So that means myself and other parliamentarians continue to speak out about the cause of Tibet in the House of Commons itself. That means continuing to speak out about it in committee when occasions arise, such as when a Tibetan delegation arrives in committee, but also potentially in terms of committee studies that can take place. We have a Canada-China committee that's specifically devoted to the Canada-China relationship. That committee is looking at human rights as part of its focus. It dovetails a bit with what I mentioned earlier about the Tibetan cause, but also how it relates to the Uyghur cause, the recent Hong Kong demonstrations, etc. I think having delegates in Canada, having delegations visit Canada, prior to the COVID world, we had the opportunity to have the Zeekgyab come on different occasions. He was meant to come in March, but that time, very early March, that time we were foiled by the snow, not by the virus. But somehow these things are conspiring against us a little bit. But I think those are important sort of vehicles in terms of having the delegations visit and working particularly with our southern neighbors, people like Mateo and Sophie and Dorjila, because we have sort of a common front on this issue from the North American perspective. I think those would be sort of the immediate starting points.
Just in the Canadian context, I think I'd add in terms of generating public awareness about Panchen Lama's case or about the Tibet issue, you have some great NGOs advocating for Tibet in Canada, whether it's the Canada Tibet Committee that's been there for several decades, and Students for Free Tibet Canada, also for the Canadian youth to learn about the Tibet issue.
Yes, no, I'd agree with that completely. The CTC and Sherab Turchin and SFT and Sonam CHOEKYI, things like also the Tibetan Canadian Cultural Center, Sonam Lankar, Wangyo, the TWAO, all of them have been doing very, very important work. And they have been instrumental in helping to amplify this work and really just increasing some of the learning. I think everyone on the planet knows about His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I think awareness about the Panchen Lama is a little bit less among the general Canadian populace, but that is our job as elected representatives to ensure that people are aware of the case of the Panchen Lama, and importantly, going back to what Sophie mentioned, the longevity of his detention and how long he has been not heard from is really quite staggering in terms of global proportions. So getting that word out and making it almost as equally understood as the situation with the Dalai Lama.
Thank you, Eric. The next question is from the US, and it's for Zeekgyab Rinpoche. And it states, Rinpoche, what is the significance of the Panchen Lama lineage to Tashi Lombo Monastery?
Naso. Tadi chidang ranzo pyogi shegyulya namla ngima dawa sala gyawa penchen che sungwa nangshin ane che gyawa yepse nis che ane sungso yore ane dezamdo masebe ane chino kongsa kyamgu chimbo choki ane chigi ishe ingje de che tu tsawa chimbe kwa ne ane chigi karso gore densa Tashi Lombo da che yo tsangme ki rigu shuba shisungi di toa ne ane chigi tate kunsi penche kunji chuchiba kinti chugi ngima cho angwenzin ni kyang namba tang chen so na wala soba de chagi yore ani di chik tang daga na shin ani gecho gindun jubgi ani thoma Tashi Lombo cha table ta sungso le ya ani ji gecho ngaba chimbe gi ani pension kunji shibal ya to so kharso gore densa Tashi Lombo ti chi namba tabu tinreji sungso tabu chi yore hinayang ta kangda yangi zo di densa Tashi Lombo gi ani chi tembe tabo senere di tenda di gyawa yepsi ni che zo nenjin tuksu zinangi yore dinde indu ane chigi tadi kunsi penchi kundi chukchiba chimba cha shaba ina gecho kundi gindu drupni zibe gi ane denrab nishu tsaksumba chagu yore di indu denrab ki chani shana ngara chani shuba ina ya gechimba shibuchi chagi yoba tang daga nangshin kunsi penchi rinpoche gi ta kundi rimjuen gi sumbumla soba dedali ya anlo wanglo menga da chila soba dedala ya ane kabab gi gen che karso gore gen she goya di densa tashi lumbuli ya gen pabya chikda di nani thande padu ane kunje rimje gi ono menga da kanji toli ya ane chigi cheje naya li ya ge chimbu chi langu ji shu di shu chimba di chag yore da na shi des ane tashi lumbu da benje rimbuche gi pali ya lugi gi thone mixe jawa yo batang thana ta chi jawa yapse ni buti ngara zo densa tashi lumbu gi phamatabu 다 ngaranzo 다 직자시 lumbi제베 시제 premier 용기 상매기 파마다부당 대가나시 안 공리 맵이나 ngaranzo 지 배된지다 하바도 ngaranzo 대서자시 lumbi기 최대 리싱 투모 마인바 아니 지 차쇠다 람쇠 상부 여바 대다리야 아니 강에 랑신 진지 차투야 된지지 차기 요래 근제 대다가 토네 아니 군시 펜션 무지기 내되디 칩시기 내되 마인바 오다 라저 된지기 토데 당 아니 최적의 균생 아니 거바 두마텔라 때니 아니 괜히 자실로 무디 야 믹세기 괜히 첨부시 차기 요레스 제슈이
Just a summary of Rinpoche's response to the question. He said, the first Dalai Lama founded Deshilombo Monastery in 1447, and the fifth Dalai Lama bestowed Deshilombo to the fourth Panchen Lama. And since that time, the Panchen Lama lineage has overseen Deshilombo. And monks of the monastery continue to practice and preserve the precious scriptures of the Panchen Lamas, which are the monastery's most important treasures. And that there is a unique historical bond between the Panchen Lamas and Deshilombo Monastery, and that this is a bond that the Chinese government can never break, despite its attempts to interfere in the rightful selection of the 11th Panchen Lama. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama and His Holiness the Panchen Lama are like parents for us. And it's not possible for us to run the monastery without these two important spiritual gurus. And it is therefore critical to us, to Tibetan Buddhists and religious freedom advocates everywhere, that the 11th Panchen Lama be freed and restored to his rightful place in Deshilombo Monastery. So our next question is for Matteo. What opportunities does ICT see for the Panchen Lama campaign and the Tibet movement in a post-COVID-19 world? At a time when China is under immense global scrutiny for its lack of transparency and accountability, its repression of Uyghurs and Hong Kongers, how can we ensure that the issue of Tibet and the Panchen Lama are included in this discourse?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. I think it's true. There is, there is scrutiny about what China has been doing on the coronavirus epidemic, but at the same time, unfortunately, there is also a very well-organized propaganda effort by the Chinese government to actually gain the upper hand in this geopolitical, dynamic that has evolved. I think we saw that coming already over a month ago, when the Chinese government, started to say that, they were going to control the Wuhan, epidemic, and it started to spread around the world. It was very clear the Chinese government, saw an opportunity to try to, first of all, start, some disinformation campaign, and there have been efforts to say that the virus started, due to, the American military, or it was present already in Italy before it was in China, through their own official channels. But most importantly, I think as the global economy slows down and we are all going into recession, if the Chinese government, will be able to restart their economy first, I can see quite a number of governments, especially in Europe, that would be in need to try to have access to the Chinese market. Something similar that happened also in 2008 with the recession. And actually, this is a good reminder for our movement, because actually in 2008 were also the biggest demonstrations in Tibet. For many decades that took place. It was also the Beijing in the Olympics with the campaign to try, the Tibetan movement to boycott the Olympics. But after the economic recession, actually the Chinese government put Tibet on the scale and requested governments actually to stop even meeting with the Dalai Lama officially. So they had the influence. So I think there is an awakening in a number of governments. I can see, that in the US, this is an issue that in a bipartisan way now is confronted with China. And I see also in some other governments, especially the national security apparatus, they see this danger of China trying to gain more access. So I think, frankly, for the Tibet movement, to make it short, we have a story to tell. The lack of information, the lack of transparency, which is now has some impact on the global level coming from China, has been experienced in Tibet for 6 decades. The Tibetan has seen it. They have seen those policies, and unless China changes their rules, changes their system, this will affect the entire world. And I think so. The Tibetans, because they have chosen nonviolence, for many decades, they continue to advocate for dialogue and for peaceful resolution. I think we are in a good position to present a case to members of parliament, to people in government who want to produce some meaningful change in China, basically political reforms, rule of law reforms. And Tibet is a good place where to start, because actually the Tibetans have made proposals which are very reasonable, which will increment freedoms and more information and respect of human rights for the people in China. And so I think this could be a benefit for the international community if they have the insights, and the strategic mind to see that as an opportunity.
Right, thank you, Matteo. I'll have our last question, and I'd like to open it up to all the panelists, but maybe we'll start with Denzit Ojala if he wants to answer it first. And it touches on some things that Matteo and Arif have already mentioned. Is what the Chinese government has done in the case of the 11th Panchen Lama precursor of what it hopes to do in the case of the 15th Dalai Lama? And if so, how do we stop that? So the US Congress has taken a very strong public stance on this issue, but not many other governments have. So what can other governments do? What can NGOs do? What can religious freedom advocates do to prepare for the Chinese offensive on this issue?
Thank you. Yes, I would love to start answering that question. This is perhaps one of the most serious matters, as His Holiness Dalai Lama has reached advanced age. And China has been daydreaming that they can do exactly the same thing they did to Panchen Lama. But I'll say, wait. Think carefully. And His Holiness Dalai Lama is someone who is internationally respected for his peaceful conflict resolution and moral leadership. And he wants to resolve, China-Tibet issue non-violently and peacefully through middle way approaches. And this is a mutually beneficial approach that China must listen and should not continue to play the power game here. To answer your question very briefly so that others can speak too, at the international level, I know the Tibet's Policy and Support Act is great, and I think that could also be replicated in European Parliament and other parts of the world, so that we all come together, unified, to take a stand, which is simple. We said, whatever His Holiness the Dalai Lama and people of Tibet decide, we will support that. There's nothing difficult about it. And in my meetings with some, Chinese people, I've been saying that ultimately it is His Holiness the Dalai Lama who will decide about his own reincarnation. If China-Tibet issue does not get resolved while he is alive, you know what? He will be reborn in a free country. Mark my word. He is not a Panchen Lama in your hands. He is in India. Tibet's struggle will continue, and you cannot shut us up. You cannot shut the world up fighting for freedom and justice. So therefore, it's better to listen, because the Dalai Lama is not under your control right now. And if you would like him to work with you, talk to him and resolve the Tibet issue, and then you might have to say something in the future incarnation of the Dalai Lama. Otherwise, you have no say in this matter, period.
All right, thank you, Denzit Ojala. Do any of the other panelists, would you like to say anything on the topic? Rinpoche.
No, say. Tadi tanda chino kongsa kyangbu chumbu chogi tanda kun chen cheme gi yangsi digi thogi di insare chesa di liya chino kongsa kyangbu chumbu cho tadi ko ni ki thuda che shi dang ane chino ko se kembu chimbu cho ki lamden shi sung ki thone nang ko ya shi chag yor ma do shen su shi gi jang adi tolia ane gongba shebala soba de nang ba yin na ane jawa me ba tabu dang ane chi gi zawa ni ne thobda me ba tabu de chi chag yor di indu ngaran zo gi zo ane chino ko se kembu chung cho ki ane gongshi shi sung ane nang ko ya oda de chi chag yor es shue.
So Suchana Rinpoche, it just said that, you know, the decision of the 15th Dalai Lama and the selection is only for His Holiness to decide. And if someone else were to decide that they would have no legitimacy in such a selection. And so we must look to His Holiness for guidance on this issue. Any other remarks?
I can add something.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. So as we have talked about, the Tibetan Policy and Support Act is now in the Senate. It passed the House, so everything is stuck in the Senate. As you know, they're only talking about, naturally the coronavirus, epidemic, but we're hopeful that there could be some action before the end of the year. But we have already started with our offices in Europe also to have questions to governments. And actually, if you go to our website, savetibet.org, you can find some of the answers from governments, from the Netherlands, from Belgium, from Germany. There was a response from the European Commission to which we are going to follow up. So I think it would be important for people who are watching to get in touch with with us, with other Tibet supergroups in your countries, and start contacting members of parliament and asking them to raise questions with the governments. And frankly, that there's this system of the parliamentary questions in which you can put the government on record. And frankly, if the constitutions of every country still mean something, the only answer they can give is it's in support of religious freedom. And I think this is a good strategy to try to put pressure early on, as was mentioned by Sophie, on governments to let them understand that despite the pressure that will come from China, this is not something that will fly with international public opinion, and there will be a political price to pay if they do that. So I think that's one way to do that. And on the case of the Panchen Lama, I think continuing to petition. We have a petition going on today in the US. Sign on. There are these efforts by the CTA for the next month to mobilize. Continue to speak up. Continue to raise this issue. Talk to your friends. This is something that anybody can understand why this is wrong and should stop.
Great, thank you, Matteo.
Emma, maybe I could add quickly. Oh, sorry. Because I know there was also a question about Chinese government influence within the UN system. And, the Tibet movement has for a long time, I think, made very good use of the UN human rights mechanisms and especially the special experts to raise issues like the Panchen Lamas. And I think we share the concerns about growing Chinese government influence within the UN system. And, we've said repeatedly, that if any other government in the world was arbitrarily detaining 1 million Muslims, we would already see, a UN fact-finding mission or a commission of inquiry or discussion about accountability. But because it's China, those avenues are blocked. The UN system is an insanely Byzantine and complicated machine. China has a lot of time and resources to throw at that. And I can think of, far worse uses of the time and the energy and the brainpower of governments like Canada's and the US, but also other governments, particularly democracies, to come up with a plan that serves as a counterweight to growing Chinese government influence within the Human Rights Council or the selection of special procedures. But I also think that at a very political level, to me, it's appalling that the Dalai Lama has never been received at the UN's headquarters or been into the Palais Wilson in Geneva, which is sort of the global headquarters of the UN's human rights movement. And I think it is long overdue for governments to push for that kind of recognition, because it is that conferring of legitimacy. It is recognizing him and the people in this community as the legitimate interlocutors of what happens to Tibetans inside and outside of China. And I think that is an urgent project for governments who have engaged on these issues for years. And people should call their elected representatives, and hopefully elected representatives like Mr. Varani, who's obviously fought in these trenches for a long time, will help push his foreign ministry, and others will do the same, and to make them take that position forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sophie. I think that's a great place to end today's talk. And so thank you so much to all of our viewers, to all of our panelists participating today, and to Dashi Lumbo Monastery for convening this talk. And I'd just like to end this talk with an appeal to all of our viewers. Let's not end this discussion of the Panchen Lama and limit it to just today. His case represents a deep injustice that demands action. And like Matteo said, many organizations have Panchen Lama campaigns, have information on their websites, they have petitions, so those campaigns need your support. So I encourage you to please visit those websites and see how you can help. And we'll have links to those websites in the live stream post. Okay, so thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.